The morning mist clung to the streets of Cedar Falls like a shroud, and Joseph Joe Crowfeather could feel the change coming. Not just in the weather, though his weathered hands told him the barometric pressure was dropping fast, but in the way people's eyes slid away from his when he walked down Main Street. Joe adjusted the worn leather strap of his tool bag and continued toward the Morrison house, where he'd been hired to repair the back porch steps. At 52, he'd learned to read the subtle signs of trouble the same way he read the sky, the way Mrs. Henderson clutched her purse tighter when he passed, the way young Billy Thompson stopped mid-sentence when Joe approached the general store, the way Sheriff Harrison's hand rested a little too casually on his gun belt during their brief nod of acknowledgement. "Morning, Joe," called out a familiar voice. Margaret Sullivan emerged from her bakery, flour dusting her green apron, her red hair catching the weak sunlight filtering through the overcast sky. She was one of the few people in Cedar Falls who still looked him straight in the eye when she spoke. "Morning, Maggie." Joe's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who chose his words carefully. "Storm's coming. Big one, by the feel of it." Maggie glanced up at the grey sky, then back at Joe with concern. "How can you tell?" The weather report on the radio said clear skies through the weekend. Joe's dark eyes studied the western horizon, where clouds were building in a pattern he'd learned to recognize from his grandfather's teachings. Radio doesn't know what the wind carries, doesn't know what the birds are saying. Before Maggie could respond, the sharp crack of footsteps on wooden planks drew their attention. Charles Whitmore descended from his black Cadillac, his silver-headed cane tapping against the sidewalk with each deliberate step. Behind him, Sheriff Harrison emerged from the courthouse, his face set in grim determination. "There he is," Whitmore announced loudly enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear, "the thief who's been stealing from honest, hard-working people." Joe's jaw tightened, but he remained still. He'd faced false accusations before. It was a burden that came with being one of the few Native Americans in a town that still remembered the Indian Wars in family stories passed down through generations. "Now hold on, Charles." Maggie stepped forward, her voice sharp with indignation. "Joe's never stolen anything from anyone in this town. He's fixed half the roofs and porches in Cedar Falls, always for fair payment." Whitmore's cold blue eyes fixed on her with disdain. "Mrs. Sullivan, I appreciate your charitable nature, but facts are facts. My safe was broken into last night. $300 missing and several valuable documents. And this," he held up a small beaded bracelet, "was found on the ground outside my bank." Joe's hand instinctively moved to his wrist, where an identical bracelet, made by his late wife, usually rested. His eyes met Whitmore's, and he saw the calculating coldness there. This wasn't about theft. This was about the 20 acres of land on the ridge that Whitmore had been trying to buy from Joe for the past 2 years. Land that had been in Joe's family since before the town existed. "That's not mine," Joe said quietly. Though he knew the truth didn't matter here, Sheriff Harrison stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his revolver. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with me, Joe. We need to have a talk down at the station." "Bill Harrison, you know damn well Joe didn't steal anything." Maggie's voice rose with anger. "This is nothing but—" "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," Harrison interrupted, his voice taking on an official tone that brooked no argument. "This is police business." Joe looked around at the faces gathering on the street. Some showed uncertainty, others suspicion, and a few, like old Mrs. Peterson, who remembered when Joe had saved her grandson from drowning in Miller's Creek, showed quiet distress. But none showed the courage to speak up against 2 of the most powerful men in town. "I'll come," Joe said simply, handing his tool bag to Maggie. "But I didn't take anything that wasn't mine." As Harrison led him toward the courthouse, Joe caught sight of young Tommy Sullivan peering around the corner of the bakery, his green eyes wide with confusion and fear. The boy had always been fascinated by Joe's stories about reading the weather and tracking animals. Now he was seeing the ugly reality of how the adult world worked. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. Judge Carmichael, Whitmore's brother-in-law, heard the evidence with perfunctory attention. The beaded bracelet, the testimony of Whitmore's bank clerk, who claimed to have seen a suspicious Indian lurking around the building, and the sheriff's report that Joe had been uncooperative during questioning. Joe's court-appointed lawyer, a nervous young man fresh out of law school, made a half-hearted attempt at defense. But when Whitmore took the stand and spoke about the need to protect decent folks from those who don't respect civilized ways, the outcome was sealed. "Joseph Crow Feather," Judge Carmichael intoned, "you are hereby ordered to leave the boundaries of Cedar Falls and the surrounding county within 24 hours. Any return will result in immediate arrest and imprisonment." As Joe walked out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sky had darkened considerably. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain and something else. Something that made his old bones ache with warning. He found Maggie waiting by her truck, Tommy at her side. "This isn't right, Joe," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Everyone knows you're honest. This is just Whitmore's way of stealing your land." Joe nodded, his gaze fixed on the western sky, where lightning flickered silently in the distance. "He can have the land, Maggie, but he can't have what comes with knowing it." "What do you mean?" Joe turned to look at the town that had been his home for over 30 years. The place where he'd buried his wife, where he'd built a quiet life on the margins of a community that had never fully accepted him. "My grandfather used to tell me about the great flood of 1889. How the old ones knew the signs, knew the safe paths to high ground. How many lives were saved because people listened to wisdom instead of pride." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "The signs are all here, Maggie. Stronger than I've ever seen them. This storm—" Joe shook his head. "This storm is going to test everyone in Cedar Falls. I just hope someone remembers how to listen." As Joe climbed into his old pickup truck, loading the few possessions he could carry, the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time he reached the town limits, the rain was coming down in sheets, and the thunder was no longer distant. Behind him, the lights of Cedar Falls flickered in the storm, unaware that they had just banished their only chance of survival. 3 days after Joe's expulsion, the rain had not stopped. What had begun as a typical autumn storm had evolved into something Cedar Falls had never experienced, a relentless deluge that turned streets into rivers and yards into lakes. Margaret Sullivan stood at her bakery window, watching the water creep steadily up Main Street. The storm drains had given up hours ago, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of water cascading down from the hills. Her hands trembled as she held a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "Mama, the water's in the basement now," Tommy called from the stairs, leading down to the bakery's storage area. His voice carried a note of fear that he was trying hard to suppress. "Come up here, honey," Maggie called back, her eyes never leaving the street. Across the way, she could see other shop owners moving their goods to higher shelves, their faces grim with growing realization that this was beyond anything they'd prepared for. The radio crackled from the corner table, where she'd been listening to increasingly frantic weather reports. Unprecedented rainfall totals, dam at Miller's Creek showing signs of stress. Residents in low-lying areas should consider evacuation routes may be bzzed. The transmission dissolved into static, and Maggie felt her stomach clench with fear. Miller's Creek ran right through the heart of Cedar Falls. If that dam failed— A loud banging on her front door interrupted her thoughts. Sheriff Harrison stood on her porch, water streaming from his hat and coat, his usual bluster replaced by obvious panic. "Maggie, you need to get to higher ground, now," he said as she opened the door. "The dam's cracking. Army Corps of Engineers say it might not hold through the night." "Where are we supposed to go, Bill?" Maggie demanded. "The main road out of town is already flooded. Jim Peterson tried to drive out an hour ago and had to turn back. Water's up to his truck windows on the North Road." Harrison's face was pale beneath his soaked hat. We're setting up an evacuation center at the school. It's on the highest ground in town." "The school's barely 15 feet higher than Main Street," Maggie pointed out. "If that dam goes, the school won't help anybody." "It's all we got," Harrison snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. For the first time since she'd known him, Bill Harrison looked genuinely frightened. As if summoned by their conversation, Charles Whitmore appeared in the doorway behind Harrison, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled by the storm. His expensive coat was soaked through, and his silver hair hung limp against his scalp. "Sheriff, what's the status on the emergency broadcast?" Whitmore demanded. "We need to get word to the state authorities. This town needs immediate assistance." "Phone lines are down, Charles. Radio tower too. We're cut off until this storm passes." Whitmore's face went white. For all his wealth and influence, he was trapped in Cedar Falls just like everyone else. There has to be some way out of the valley. Maggie looked at both men with growing disgust. There is someone who would know the way out. Someone who's lived in these hills all his life, who knows every old trail and high path for 50 miles around. Harrison's face darkened. "Now, Maggie, don't start. Joe Crowfeather," she continued, ignoring the sheriff's warning. "You remember Joe, don't you? The man you ran out of town 3 days ago based on lies and planted evidence." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "That Indian is gone, and good riddance. We don't need some primitive savage." "That primitive savage warned us this storm was coming," Maggie interrupted, her voice rising with fury. "He tried to tell us, but nobody would listen, and now you want to hide in the school while the water rises around us?" Before anyone could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. Dr. Samuel Morrison stepped through the doorway, water dripping from his medical bag and coat. "The Morrison place is flooding," he said grimly. "Lost 3 patients I was treating for pneumonia. Had to evacuate them to the clinic, but even that's starting to take on water." He looked at the 3 faces before him. "I couldn't help but overhear. Maggie's right about Joe. He knows these hills better than anyone." "He's been banished," Harrison said firmly. "Even if we wanted to, which we don't, he's probably long gone by now." "No, he's not," Tommy spoke up from behind his mother, drawing surprised looks from the adults. "I saw him yesterday, up on Eagle Ridge. He's got a camp up there in the old caves." "Tommy, what were you doing on Eagle Ridge in this weather?" Maggie demanded. The 12-year-old flushed but met her eyes steadily. "I was worried about him, Mama. I know you were too. I took him some bread and coffee. He said the water would rise fast once it started, and that the old people used to have special paths to safety." Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "The Lakota lived in this valley for generations before the town was established. They would have survived floods like this before. I don't care if he parts the waters like Moses," Whitmore snarled. "I will not beg for help from some thieving—" His words were cut off by a sound that made everyone freeze, a deep, rumbling crack that seemed to come from the earth itself. Through the bakery window, they could see other townspeople stopping in the street, all looking toward the north where Miller's Creek wound through the hills. "Was that—" Dr. Morrison began. Another crack, louder this time, followed by a sound like distant thunder that didn't stop. In the eerie silence that followed, they could hear a new sound growing, the roar of moving water getting closer. "The dam," Harrison whispered. "Sweet Jesus, the dam's going." Maggie grabbed Tommy's hand and pushed past the men toward the door. "We need to get to higher ground, now." "Where?" Whitmore demanded, his composure finally cracking completely. "Where can we go?" Maggie turned back to look at him, her green eyes blazing with determination. "We're going to find Joe Crowfeather, and we're going to pray he's willing to save the people who destroyed his life." Outside, the roar of approaching water was getting louder, and the first screams could be heard from the lower part of town as the flood surge began its devastating journey toward Cedar Falls. The rain continued to fall, and in the distance, lightning illuminated the mountainous wall of water racing down the valley toward the town that had forgotten how to listen to the wisdom of the land. The water came like a living thing, swallowing Main Street in a matter of minutes. From her position, halfway up the hill, leading to Eagle Ridge, Maggie could see the lights of Cedar Falls disappearing one by one as the floods swept through the town below. She wasn't alone in her desperate climb toward the old caves. Behind her, a ragged group of survivors struggled up the muddy slope, Dr. Morrison carrying his medical bag and helping elderly Mrs. Peterson, Sheriff Harrison supporting a limping Charles Whitmore, and nearly 24 other townspeople who had followed them in their flight from the rising waters. Tommy, despite his mother's protests, had taken the lead. The boy moved with surprising confidence through the storm, following paths that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. "How much further?" called out Harrison, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Not far," Tommy shouted back. "I can see the light from his fire." Indeed, through the driving rain and darkness, a warm orange glow could be seen emanating from a cave opening about 50 yards up the slope. As they drew closer, a familiar silhouette appeared in the entrance. Tall, steady, unmistakably Joe Crow Feather. He watched their approach without surprise, as if he'd been expecting them. When they reached the cave, breathless and soaked to the bone, Joe simply stepped aside to let them enter. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, carved deep into the ridge by centuries of water flow. Joe had created a comfortable shelter with a small fire near the entrance, its smoke drawn up through a natural chimney in the rock ceiling. Blankets and supplies were neatly arranged along the walls. "How many more are down there?" Joe asked quietly, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he looked at the bedraggled group. "We don't know," Dr. Morrison answered, settling Mrs. Peterson near the fire. "Maybe 50, 60 people made it to the school before the water hit, but if the whole dam went—" Joe nodded grimly. "It did. I could hear it from here. The school won't hold. Water will be up to the second floor within the hour." Charles Whitmore, who had been uncharacteristically silent during the climb, finally spoke up. His voice was hoarse and strained. Is there a way to reach them?" Joe studied the man who had orchestrated his exile, his expression unreadable. "There are old paths the Lakota used during the spring floods, paths that stay above the water even when the valley fills. But they're dangerous in this storm, and I'd need to guide people in the dark." "You'd do that?" Maggie asked softly. After what they did to you?" Joe was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, but also something deeper, a resolve born of compassion rather than bitterness. "My grandfather used to tell me that the land doesn't choose sides. It just is. When someone's drowning, you don't ask if they deserve to be saved, you just reach out your hand." He stood and began gathering rope and supplies from his carefully organized stores. "But I can't do it alone. The path is treacherous, and I'll need people to help guide the others. People who won't panic when the trail gets narrow." "I'll go," Tommy said immediately, earning a sharp look from his mother. "Absolutely not," Maggie began, but Joe held up a hand. "The boy knows these hills now," Joe said, "and he's small enough to get through some places adults can't. But," he looked directly at Tommy, "you follow my lead exactly. No heroics, no taking chances. Understood?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "I'll go too," Dr. Morrison volunteered. "If there are injured people—" "And me," Maggie added firmly. "I know most of the people in that school. They'll trust me to guide them." Joe looked at Sheriff Harrison and Charles Whitmore. Both men were pale and shaken, clearly out of their element in this wilderness emergency. "Sheriff, I need you to stay here and maintain order. Keep people calm, keep the fire going. Mr. Whitmore—" Joe paused, studying the banker's face. "Can you follow orders without question? Lives will depend on it." Whitmore's pride warred visibly with his fear. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "I'll do whatever you say." "Good. You'll be our rear guard, making sure no one gets left behind." As Joe distributed rope and simple supplies, he explained the route they would take, a series of connected ledges and deer paths that wound around the ridge, staying above the floodline, but requiring careful navigation in the storm. "The most dangerous part is Devil's Backbone," he said, pointing to a crude map he'd scratched in the dirt. "It's a narrow ridge with steep drops on both sides. In this rain, it'll be slippery as ice. We'll rope everyone together there." "How long will it take?" Maggie asked. "To get to the school and back? 4 hours minimum. Maybe 6 if we have injured people or if the weather gets worse." Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. Lightning continued to flash, briefly illuminating the catastrophic scene below, where Cedar Falls lay beneath dark, swirling water. "People are going to die if we wait," Dr. Morrison said quietly. Joe nodded and shouldered his pack. "Then we don't wait." The journey to the school was a nightmare of mud, rain, and treacherous footing. Joe led them along paths that seemed to exist only in his memory, his sure feet finding purchase on wet rock and slippery earth where others would have fallen. Twice they had to stop and pull each other up particularly difficult sections. Once, Whitmore slipped and would have fallen 30 feet into churning floodwater if not for Joe's quick reflexes in grabbing his rope. "Thank you," Whitmore gasped, his face white with shock. Joe simply nodded and continued climbing. When they finally reached the school, they found chaos. The building was surrounded by dark water that lapped at the second-story windows. Frightened faces peered out at them, and voices called desperately through the storm. "How do we get them out?" Maggie shouted over the wind. Joe studied the situation, his experienced eyes taking in the water levels, the building's condition, and the growing crowd of survivors visible in the upper windows. "We'll have to go in through the roof," he decided. "Tommy, you're with me. Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Sullivan, you help get people organized. Mr. Whitmore, you anchor the rope line." Udbudni, what followed, was the most harrowing rescue operation any of them had ever experienced. Joe and Tommy worked together to break through the school's roof, creating an opening large enough for people to climb through. Then, one by one, the survivors were guided out and roped together for the treacherous journey to safety. There were 53 people in the school, including 17 children. Some were injured, others were panicked, and all were terrified. But Joe's calm presence and clear instructions began to organize the chaos. "Listen to me," he called out to the frightened crowd as they huddled on the school's roof. "I know paths that will get us to high ground, but you have to trust me and follow exactly. Stay close, stay quiet, and don't look down." The journey back was even more difficult with so many people, especially the children and elderly. But Joe's planning proved sound. He had positioned the strongest adults at regular intervals along the line, creating a human chain that could support and guide the weaker members. At Devil's Backbone, the narrow ridge that had worried Joe most, they formed a human chain with everyone roped together. One by one, they inched across the treacherous passage, Joe and Tommy guiding from the front, while Whitmore, despite his earlier terror, proved surprisingly steady in helping people across from the rear. When they finally reached the safety of the caves as dawn was breaking, exhausted survivors collapsed around the expanded fire that Sheriff Harrison had maintained. Dr. Morrison immediately began treating the injured, while Maggie and others organized food and blankets. As the immediate crisis passed and people began to realize they were safe, they turned to look at the man who had saved them. Joe sat slightly apart from the group, staring out at the flooded valley where his home had been. Charles Whitmore approached him slowly, his expensive clothes torn and muddy, his face haggard with exhaustion and something else. "Shame. Joe," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. What I did." Joe looked up at him with tired eyes. "Your bank is underwater, Charles. Your money, your papers, your safe, all of it's gone. Does the land still matter so much? Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice broke. I was wrong. About everything. The theft, the accusations. I planted that bracelet. I paid Harrison to look the other way. I wanted your land so badly that I... He stopped, unable to continue. I know, Joe said simply. Is there any way you can forgive me? Joe studied the broken man before him, a man who had lost everything he thought mattered and discovered what really did. Forgiveness isn't something you ask for, Charles. It's something you earn, and it starts with making things right. As the survivors settled in to wait for the floodwaters to recede, word began to spread through the group about what had really happened. How Joe had been falsely accused, how he had been banished from the town, and how he had risked his life to save the very people who had rejected him. Sheriff Harrison, faced with the truth and the judgment of his neighbors, quietly removed his badge and handed it to Joe. I don't deserve to wear this, he said. You're twice the man I ever was. Joe handed the badge back. The town will need law and order when we rebuild, but it needs to be honest law. Over the following days, as the waters receded and the full extent of the devastation became clear, the survivors worked together to establish a temporary camp and begin the long process of rebuilding. Joe's knowledge of the land proved invaluable in determining where to rebuild safely, which areas to avoid, and how to work with the natural flow of water rather than against it. But perhaps more importantly, something fundamental had changed in the survivors. The shared experience of depending on each other for survival, of seeing past their prejudices in a moment of crisis, had created bonds that transcended the old divisions. Tommy Sullivan, now regarded as something of a hero for his role in the rescue, spent his days learning from Joe about reading the land and weather. Other children joined them, eager to understand the knowledge that had saved their lives. Maggie reopened her bakery in a new location Joe helped choose, and it became the unofficial community center where plans for the new Cedar Falls were discussed and decided. Charles Whitmore used his remaining resources to help establish a fund for rebuilding, and when Joe's land ownership was confirmed by documents that survived in the state capitol, Whitmore publicly apologized for his false accusations and transferred additional land to Joe as restitution. 6 months later, as the new Cedar Falls began to take shape on higher ground, the town council held its first official meeting. Joe had been unanimously elected as the new sheriff, though he insisted on sharing the duties with Bill Harrison, who had worked hard to redeem himself. As the meeting concluded, Joe stood on the porch of the new town hall, looking out over the rebuilt community. The building sat on a hill overlooking the valley, positioned exactly where his grandfather had told him the old Lakota village had been located, high enough to stay safe, close enough to the water to thrive. Maggie joined him on the porch, Tommy at her side. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. This change in people. Joe was quiet for a moment, watching children play in the street below. White children and the few Native American children from neighboring areas, all playing together without thought of difference. "People forget," he said finally, "but the land remembers. And as long as someone's here to listen to what it has to say, maybe this time will be different." Thunder rumbled in the distance, not the threatening sound of disaster, but the gentle promise of needed rain. Joe smiled and went inside to join his community, no longer an outsider looking in, but a valued member of a town that had learned the hard way that wisdom comes in many forms, and survival depends on listening to all of them. The quiet Indian had found his voice, and Cedar Falls had found its soul.